Hello and welcome to a new program we're launching today on GNAT-TV. We're calling it a civil discussion, and the goal is to consider ways we can talk more civilly and respectfully to each other across ideological, political, maybe cultural lines to help us reach a better understanding of opinions that might be different from the ones that we might hold, and to foster dialogue across some of those boundary lines. We may not wind up agreeing with those who don't see the world the same way that we do, or in some of the issues that are dividing us from each other, but maybe we can come away with a little more understanding about where our fellow citizens are coming from and perhaps give ourselves an opportunity to reflect on our own standpoints. I'm Andrew McKeever, and usually I work on the station's news project, but this is going to be a bit of a different venture, and we'll get into some more opinion-based questions and content, perhaps. And before I go any further, I just want to say it's a great pleasure to be joined as co-host by Keelan, who's no stranger to GNAT-TV, and I know no stranger to many of you viewers. Don has hosted discussion programs here before. He lives in Arlington and is a well-known community figure and prolific op-ed writer, I might add as well. His work has appeared in VT Digger, as well as the Bennington Banner and the Manchester Journal, and probably several other places as well. Don, I think this is going to be fun.
Thank you, and glad to be with you, Andrew.
Yeah, well, I think it's a very timely topic. I mean, we hear a lot about polarization across, the political spectrum. It's harder for people who like to think at some point in the past they might have disagreements with a neighbor or a friend or an uncle or somebody in the family, but they were able to have a conversation about it and not wind up screaming at each other at the end of it. Whereas it seems now, we're in a period anyway, that it just seems like that's getting more and more difficult for a lot of folks.
Well, it appears that way, and often what you hear is, never have we seen such polarization as we're seeing now. And the fact of the matter really is, to some degree, I feel, well, things are pretty calm today compared to what they might have been or were centuries ago or decades ago. And for a quick example, imagine what it must have been like in Arlington, Vermont in 1776 when a third of the town wanted to stay with King George and had no interest whatsoever of joining this rebel group that was around the corner in East Arlington, Ethan Allen and his gang.
And they didn't all just live on Tory Lane either.
We even have a street, Tory Lane. Yeah, that's right. And when you carry it forward to the period of the Civil War, not all Americans, even here in the North, were in favor of a civil war, nor were many Americans in favor of women's suffrage, or Americans in favor of prohibition, or going into World War II, or in my lifetime, and yours as well probably, we're in favor of the civil rights issues of the late 50s and 60s, and on top of that, the Vietnam War. Mm-hmm. So we've been through a lot, and we've had to deal with it. We had to be finding solutions. But I gather what may have existed then, which maybe not exist today, is a level of being civil. So,
well, that's what it seems like. I mean, thinking back over, those decades. I mean, and thinking back to like the 60s and the 70s. I mean, I remember. It seemed to me, anyway, that we could have disagreements, and sometimes they were really strident ones. I remember the demonstrations and marches of the 60s and 70s, the anti-war events, and the passions were definitely very high. But I don't remember it being a case where I thought other Americans were somehow on another team from the one I was on. I thought at the end of the day, we were all going to wind up being on the same team. And sometimes I just find myself wondering if that's still the case today. Just the tone and tenor of some of the back and forth just seems harsher.
That's, I think, in large part because the way it's reported today was not the way it was reported back in the 60s, and obviously prior to that. What I mean by that is, back in the 60s and early 70s, I gather, we had 3 national news organizations from the TV standpoint, CBS, NBC, and ABC. Mm-hmm. And the anchors of that evening news were very respected and trusted individuals. Today, it's a different ballgame. We know that. And we've heard a lot about that. And part of those shows, regardless of which side of the aisle you're on, the nature of the show is to be controversial and to create controversy. Right? And then that just spills over. And then someone who watches a lot of these programs for a number of hours a day then flips over to their social media, and now you have it spreading around. And I don't know whether they have the energy to sit down with someone from the other side to be civil. And that's what we're going to have. I believe this program is going to try to address as we move forward. Not so much today, but in the guests that we're going to try to bring, and the issues that we're going to bring forward. We have, I think you would agree, we have a number of, obviously, national issues, but we also have a number of state issues, and we have a number of local issues that have been a bit, there's been a lack of civility among the folks involved on either side. So we want to, I think, address them, but obviously we can't do it all today. And we can't resolve this thing.
No, and I think a big part of it, I think what we're going to try and achieve anyway is the idea of talking about some methodology or kind of approaches that you could take when you're in a conversation with someone who's just as passionate about something you are, but from a different point of view. And absolutely, there's no shortage of local questions, statewide issues, certainly national ones, maybe even international ones as well. That I hope that we can get into as we go along, and absolutely bring in a few special guests to hear from them, and kind of see how they approach those issues from different points of view. But I just want to back up for a second and talk about the whole difference, about the point you just made there, about the difference between how people are absorbing information now, and we both remember a time when, there were 3 major networks and maybe a couple of national newspapers, and those were kind of where people went to for their, at least their national information. And also that local newspapers were also much stronger back then, compared to 40 or 50 years ago. Local papers were very trusted and they had the manpower to go out and cover local stories, local select boards, council meetings, whatever it was, and hold those officials accountable, and then bring information that was kind of a common set of information and facts that people could work from. Whereas now we have a much more splintered situation, it seems like, and clearly it's not just the fact that we now have Fox and CNN and a few other television stations or channels that focus on news events beyond what Walter Cronkite and Huntley Brinkley would be talking about. But obviously the internet and social media in particular, we now have thousands upon thousands of sources of information we can go to. And that makes for a really splintered situation.
Well, you mentioned newspapers. And when you think of a newspaper, think of the physical paper itself. The way I see a paper today, you get the news up front, whether it's local, whether it's state, national, international. The news is up front. In the back of the paper, or later on in the paper, you get the opinions of either the publisher of the paper or other people from local sources and so forth. Years ago, and I'm going back now, when I used to deliver papers in the city of Yonkers, it was not unusual for us to deliver 10 separate newspapers a day in the morning. I'm not. You had the New York papers, but then you had those who would prefer the Jewish Forward, a paper covering the Jewish community from their perspective in Jewish, or I gather in Hebrew. Right? You had the Italian paper, the Progresso. You had the Irish Echo. That was all part of the package of papers we dropped off at people's homes back in the 1950s and early 60s. Not to mention the 5 or 6 dailies that came out in New York. The New York Times, the Herald Tribune, the Wall Street Journal, the Journal American, the Daily News, and the Daily Mirror. So there was people absorbed their news from these sources, and then in some place in the back of the paper was the opinions. Can you imagine today now, obviously there's less readership, there's less papers obviously, but at the same time you go on TV and you don't get the news so much, you get the opinion, without you then formulating an opinion about exactly what this is. I'm not saying you can't get the news, it's there, but it's just the way we're absorbing this, it appears to me, and our ability then to communicate it.
So a really interesting discussion point that is underway right now, I think, in the world of journalism, and is something I'd love for us to discuss sometimes, is the whole question around whether or not news stories should be just, on the one hand this, on the other hand that, kind of objective treatment. That should be the goal, to say, here's what so-and-so said, here's what somebody else said, and you, the reader, make up your mind about what you think. There's a certain, I'm not sure movement is the right term, but sort of a dynamic underway now where people are saying, no, it's we shouldn't be kind of just sort of trying to kind of be even-handed and objective. We should be sticking to the facts. And if someone says something that's just incorrect, it should be called out and said, no, this is not the case. Does that then skew the arc of the story somewhat? I guess that's the question. I mean, it was always interesting to me to read news articles from papers written in the early 20th and 19th century to see just how opinionated those were. I mean, they weren't news stories in the classic sense we think of them now. They were somebody saying this and that ought to happen. It's not like some council member said X and another council member said Y and blah, blah, blah. It was like much more like the reporter was saying, here's what I think. And they were like almost opinion pieces as opposed to news stories as we think of them now. But that's probably a conversation we should save for another time. And maybe bring in some people who know more about it than we do.
Well, your reference to the last, I think you said the last century. You're right. The news stories did have opinions in them, but from prior to our generation, and maybe a little bit before, the 1920s, that was all changed by, and I think the New York Times was the leader in that, and to publish just the news, and then obviously have a section on the opinions. But the news had to be factual. The news had to be straightforward. And that became the standard if you were to work as a reporter. Now, whether or not that's changed, some people feel it has changed from where it had been. And that's too bad, because, you want to know that what you're reading are the facts pertaining to that issue. And then later on, you can have a number of opinions, all right? But then let's get back to, if we can, to getting together with someone. Here's where it breaks down.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and thinking, as we were talking earlier about how did we get here, and you mentioned a couple of historical points. I mean, there's some that jump out to me. The Great Recession of 2008, 2009 certainly seemed to have been a breaking point of some point or another. You can look back to the 1970s and 1980s and sort of the economic globalization that began to happen and leaving behind many communities that had once been thriving manufacturing centers. So all of a sudden they became ghost towns, relatively speaking. And I think that contributed something to it, but there's a lot of inputs. But clearly, I think the big difference now compared to then is the social media, and and within that is this whole, I think, sense that you're not talking to somebody face to face on social media when you're writing a comment on Facebook or Twitter or one of the other platforms. You're just typing something onto your laptop or your phone or whatever. You're not having to say, I disagree with you about that to their face. And it becomes a lot easier, and I guess a lot easier for people to kind of just really jam out whatever it is on their mind at that moment without really thinking it through.
Well, there was a middle ground between what you're saying. Not that long ago, and the newspapers played a big role in this, and that was letters to the editor. In other words, and let's use an example that just occurred here in Manchester, the village or the town of Manchester. There was an announcement recently of the field house that is being proposed over at the rec park. It's about 13 million plus expenditure, and it's being planned, and it's got a whole bunch of features to it, and so forth. It came out in the newspapers last week. I understand, and I'm not on Facebook. Is it Facebook?
Yes.
Facebook. Okay. I'm not on Facebook, but I understand there's a great deal of discussion swirling around Facebook about and some of it is not nice. Now, why is it in there and it's not out in the press? Where it used to be. If Andrew McKeever had an issue with the quote field house, he'd write a letter to the editor, or Don Keelan would write a letter to the editor. We don't seem to have that anymore. Some newspapers do allow comments. Some digital newspapers do allow commentary. However, here in Vermont, the largest one, the Vermont Digger, has pulled it off. They no longer allow it, and several others have pulled off commentaries.
Where did they pull them off?
Well, I think without knowing too much about it, but I do know at one point it's because the commentary was getting too personal. It wasn't as factual as it should have been, and in the Diggers case, they just didn't want to be responsible for the so much vitriolic points that were being made, and some of it was personal, so they've just, okay. We're going to have commentary, 700-800 word columns from a series of columnists, but we're not going to have any more feedback. That's too bad. It's too bad it has gotten that way. And look at the newspapers. You don't see the level of letters to the editor that you once saw. And I'm hoping that, working with you through this program, that we can bring out what's really needed today. And I think you and I have had some discussions that we need to listen more, and we need to be patient. We need to keep our voice low, and it's a very difficult thing to do is take on the other person's point of view, step into their shoes, and above all, have respect. And I'm hoping as we go forward, we see these attributes, but if we don't see them, I think you and I need to call them out to people who have a different point of view.
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the things I'm hoping that we will discuss and get into are some of the ground rules or techniques or strategies, if you will, about how you would engage with somebody who, just maybe has a different point of view about whatever the issue might be. And that, kind of a good rule of thumb when you find yourself in such a conversation would be just to kind of maybe take a deep breath and listen first. And kind of ask them, well, How did you come about developing that opinion? What set of facts are you using to kind of get you to the point where you're saying, I believe that trade with China ought to be restricted a lot more than it is? You know, what are some of the building blocks of how you got there? And listen and hear the person out, because I really think a lot of the problem we seem to be having talking across the boundary line is that people on the other side of the fence don't seem to think that they're being listened to. I'm recalling one article I read a while ago where a person had two focus groups, assembled two focus groups to talk about, and I think it was back in the 2020 election. And they had two groups of people, one a group of suburban voters and a group of voters from one of the states in Appalachia or whatever, and they were together in the same room, and the question went back and forth. Well, what do you think the other side thinks of you? I think you are, and the suburban group said they think that we're all a bunch of elitists, and that we're too smart for our own good or something like that, and the other group of folks from a more rural area said they think we're all a bunch of hillbillies and we're ignorant and don't really understand anything beyond what we're seeing right outside our front doors. And so those perceptions, kind of the fact that they, and those both perceptions were incorrect. That obviously all the group, the suburban folks weren't all elitists, and the group of folks from more rural areas weren't all hillbillies. But they already had that impression about themselves that that's what the other side thinks. So right off the bat, the conversation was stifled.
That's a great point. That's a great analogy, and I can bring that home because I guess it was last year, a very prominent citizen here in Manchester, whose name will remain unknown, unvoiced, saw a picture of my wife and I in the newspaper with all these children, not all, but 15 kids from Harlem, Bedford-Stuyvesant, and the South Bronx, camping on our property. And they were part of a major organization in New York that comes to Vermont every year with 45 children, in groups of 15, 3 groups, and they camp on our property their first night. And we've been doing it for 23 years. And we had to cut it out. It was the year before last, so we had to cut it out because of COVID. But we've had over 850 kids, but the organization wanted a news item on it, so it was in the I guess it was in the Manchester Journal or the Bennington Banner, and so this prominent citizen from Manchester met me on some business occasion, and said he was surprised to see that we had those kids on our property. And I said, why are you surprised that we would have kids from Harlem, Bedford-Stuyvesant, and South Bronx? He said, well, you're a Republican, and all Republicans are racist. So guess what? That conversation, where do you bring that? And that was unfortunate. But again, stereotyping, setting these unfounded ground rules up front. You made a great point a minute ago about getting the facts. And how often have you been with someone discussing something and they really don't have the facts? And they think they do. But maybe we should be more grounded in the facts and then discuss, how do we deal with that?
Yeah, well, I think there's I think there's an awful lot we can all learn, from each other, and just, but also just to kind of be thoughtful anyway, when we do find ourselves in conversations with people who are of different points of view, that, listening is not a bad thing. And I guess that reminds me that, one of the things that's also part of the problem, it seems like, is that we all tend to, and it's very easy to do this because I know I do the same thing myself, is to kind of retreat within our own silos of information and our own little echo chambers, and we wind up reading newspapers whose opinion sections we agree with, or we listen to certain television stations or even websites that sort of reflect our own points of view, and we don't try to say, okay, well, why don't I go and see what they're thinking on this other channel here, just to kind of get a different point of view. I think, and I'm just making a guess here, I guess, but is that we don't tend to do that very often. I know I don't. I keep on trying to tell myself, I really have to sort of broaden my reach here, and I'm stuck at the same 5 or 6 sets of news sources or information sources, and I don't get outside that box as often as I should. It's something I try to do a lot, much more, and I don't know. Doesn't seem to work out.
Then maybe you get people that you associate with who do get outside, even though you may not agree with them, and let them share some of those facts or other stories with you. But I think our efforts could apply to a local situation that occurred here a few weeks ago, and that was over at Long Trail School. I don't know all the facts, nor do I have time to get the facts, but one thing that was very disturbing about that situation was it became public that there was a great deal of a number of issues among the faculty, the parents, and the administration, and I gather the board, for lack of any other term, communication broke down. Mm-hmm. And the parties didn't seem to be able to resolve their differences until one group, either whether it was the faculty or the parents or the students, said, we're going to, if we don't get things done our way by such and such, we're going to go outside. We're going to boycott the classroom, and we're going to be outside. That was unfortunate. That it had to, whatever the differences were that they were dealing with, had to rise to that level. That it became a threat. And if that's happening at a Long Trail School, where there's very intelligent people, very committed people, very passionate people, if that's happening there, we've got a lot of issues that are going to come at us here in Manchester and in the local, with the climate, with the housing changes, with the field house, with so many other things that are going to come at us. Is that the way we do business? Is that we do it with the threat? If you don't go along with me, I'm walking. That's what I hope we can accomplish on this program.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there for today, for this episode of A Civil Discussion. But I think we've got plenty to work with here. You just mentioned a couple of really interesting issues. I mean, there are some on the national level I think will be fun to deal with and bat around and have a guest in to, or maybe a couple of guests to say, hey, we think this, I think that. And then, sort of work at trying to implement those those listening and just the respectfulness and the trying to, broaden our own point of view a little bit and at least understand where the other person is coming from. But, we'll save all that good stuff for the next couple of shows, and we'll look forward to getting back here again. And I may also say it's great to be back here in the studio again.
Yes, it is.
I've had my share of Zoom.
Yes. Thank you.
But anyway, thanks Don, for being part of this, and we'll figure out when we're going to be back on the air next time, and we'll look forward to seeing you all again. And meanwhile, thank you for being with us today on our inaugural program, and we'll see you again the next time.